Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jonathan McCrea. It's Science Week, and this is the Festival of Farming and Food. You're very welcome to the Teagasc Food Research Centre at Moore Park, County Cork. I'll be your host today and tomorrow. And we have a couple of fantastic events lined up for you. We're here at 11 a.m. each day as School on Chapter Leach know, because they've been joining us every single day. You're very welcome. And if you want to shout out, do send in your school name and we'll say hello to you. All of these events are free thanks to sponsorship from Science Foundation Ireland and, of course, Teagasc. And we'd love to know what you think of them because we want to give you a great program again, year and year. So you will be emailed after the event to take a survey. And we'd really appreciate it if you could take time to fill that out. We'd really, really appreciate it. You can ask us questions, as I say, live now in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or on social media. And we'd love you to share photographs of what you're doing for Science Week, whether it's at home or at school or on work. All you need to do is email scienceweek@teagasc.ie, or you can tweet us on Twitter using the hashtag FestFarmFood or Science Week. So today I'd like to imagine a world without refrigeration or without freezers. Imagine if we had no way to store our food and prevent it from spoiling or going bad. Our ancient ancestors had that exact same problem. And in solving it, they discovered some of our favorite food and drinks that we enjoy today. One of the best examples of this is cheese, which I love. It was accidentally discovered when milk was stored in vessels made from animal stomachs. The Korean cuisine kimchi is also thought to have been used for thousands of years as a method to preserve cabbage and other vegetables. And these are examples of food fermentation, the oldest form of food processing, where food is preserved through the actions of microorganisms, including bacteria and fungi. Nowadays, though, the market for fermented foods like kombucha and kefir are worth billions of dollars. But if food fermentation is the world's oldest food preservation method, what about the newest? Well, in modern times, we look for foods that are healthy but also sustainable for the environment. And today, we're going to learn how Teagasc researchers are taking fermented foods and dairy products into the future with DNA sequencing, microscopy, 3D printing, and robots. But first of all, we have a video to play for you featuring the scientists from Teagasc who are here with me later on Zoom to answer any questions you might have about the science you're going to hear. We'll get to as many questions as we can, so do engage with us over Zoom or Twitter. So let's see what they had to say as we go virtually to the Teagasc Food Research Centre in Moore Park. We'll see you back in a short while.
Hi, my name is Liam Walsh and I'm a PhD researcher. Records of fermentation date back to 7000 BC. Back then, our ancient ancestors didn't know that microorganisms were responsible for making their cheese or yogurt. But in the 19th century, a French scientist called Louis Pasteur wanted to know why some foods and drinks had a sour taste. He discovered that the yeast are naturally present in wine. But when he boiled the grape juice, the yeast didn't grow and the sour and alcoholic taste was not produced. This was the first indication that microbes cause fermentation. Fermentation occurs naturally when sugars in the food, certain microorganisms, and suitable storage conditions coincide. Fermenting microorganisms act as miniature factories, enhancing the food's nutritional content and manufacturing new tastes, odors, and health-promoting qualities. Since Louis Pasteur's discovery, we've developed new ways to investigate the bacteria that ferment our foods. The bacteria most commonly associated with fermentation are lactic acid bacteria, so called because they use the sugar lactose as their energy source and produce lactic acid. It is this lactic acid that is responsible for the characteristic sour taste, while also having a preserving effect by lowering the pH of the food, creating an environment that is unsuitable for bad bacteria, preventing their growth. Lactic acid bacteria are responsible for dairy fermentations because the lactose content in milk gives them the ideal environment to thrive. Lactic acid bacteria are easy to grow in the lab on nutrient broth or agar plates, which provide them with all the nutrients they need. For decades, microbiologists have studied lactic acid bacteria, including their fermentation abilities and their potential health benefits for humans. Some strains of lactic acid bacteria are now known to be good probiotics, good bacteria which have health benefits for the host. They can help our immune system, our heart health, and help us protect from other bacteria that might cause disease. But not all microbes can be grown easily in the lab. Fermentative bacteria are by their nature anaerobic. They don't like oxygen. Here in Teagasc, we're using new DNA sequencing technology to investigate all the microbes in our fermented foods. DNA is made up of a sequence of 4 nucleotides. Think of them as letters. And the way the letters are arranged determines the genetic information they encode. In humans, this genetic information might determine what color eyes or hair we have, while for a microbe, it might determine its ability to make a tangy sourdough or particularly flavorsome cheese. To do this, we break up the food and the bacterial cells, releasing their DNA. We then run the DNA on a DNA sequencing machine, and we use computing analysis and coding to identify the microbes that were present in the food. Using this technology, we have found new species of bacteria that can influence the taste and color of cheese. DNA sequencing has also revealed that many of the potential probiotic microbes in fermented foods can also be found in the human gut. This means that when we consume fermented foods, the good bacteria can adapt and survive in our gut.
My name is Deirdre Kennedy, and I'm the Microstructure Technologist at Teagasc Food Research Centre, Moorpark. We know that microscopes can be used to look at bacteria, but what about food? What's beneath the surface? I work in the National Food Imaging Centre in Teagasc Moorpark. Our research looks at the composition, formulation, and processing of food and the effect that they have on the microstructure of food. We can say that all foods have a structure. This structure may be formed on different levels by a combination of the various ingredients and processes that take place when it's being made. We need to understand how processing of food creates a product structure and how ingredients and raw materials interact to form structures. For example, the same ingredients are used to make cream, where water is the continuous phase, and make butter, which is an oil continuous spread. This is because we change the structure of foods during processing. For example, even though cheese and yogurt are both fermented milk products, they have completely different colour, taste and texture. Does a wobbly set yogurt feel different in your mouth than a smooth, drinkable yogurt? Of course it does. The structure forms during the fermentation process, and the texture of the food depends on how different components such as fats, proteins and carbohydrates interact with each other, as well as the water and air present in the food. These ingredients also influence the nutritional quality of the food, while the sugar content can also influence the fermentation process by the bacteria. Here at the National Food Imaging Centre in Moorpark, we use state-of-the-art microscopes to look at the structure of food up close. We can look at the various ingredients, the size of particles, how they interact with each other, and how this changes the texture and functionality of foods. We can look at the microorganisms in our fermented foods and see their size and shape, see if they're alive or dead. We have specialised equipment we can attach to various microscopes so we can watch how the food structure changes during heating, cooling or mechanical stress. This process here helps us understand the breaking process of cheese when we eat it. We have a high-speed camera that can film up to 100,000 frames per second. We use this to look at fast processes in slow motion, like tracking how a powder particle dissolves in water. We can play detective with equipment that can identify individual components such as contaminants. We can scan a food and identify all components by their chemical fingerprints. This allows us to trace contaminants, identify functional ingredients, and track where all components are located in a food, telling us so much about what our food is made up of and in what way. We even use virtual reality to look inside our foods. Did you ever think you could put your head inside a loaf of bread and see its every detail? Did you think you could walk inside a meat carcass? With the virtual reality headset and controls, we can immerse ourselves in the food and do real-life 4-dimensional analysis. Instead of seeing things in 2D and 3D on screens, we can, for example, measure the air spaces in this tiny powder particle using hand controllers with clever software and Oculus headsets. This gives a really good idea of how these structures are built and help us understand how to create the perfect crunch, chew, or slurp.
Hi, I'm Ricardo Uribe. I'm a PhD student in Teagasc Moore Park. It's hard to get kids to eat healthy food sometimes. A little creativity can help. My project is called 3D Dairy, and it's about using 3D printing for developing new dairy snacks. 3D printing is a process of building solid objects layer by layer of any material capable of fusing and forming stable self-supporting structures. The origin of this technology goes back to the 70s. The most common materials used by 3D printers are plastic and metals. I will be using food. In the food industry, 3D printing is still at an early stage, but with great potential to develop high-value food products. So far, food products that have a paste-type consistency have been mostly used for 3D food printing, as they can behave like a liquid or solid under specific conditions. Food with this unique behavior are also known as viscoelastic foods. Cheese is viscoelastic. For example, cheddar cheese at room temperature is hard, behaves like a solid. But if you heat it, it can flow and behaves like a liquid, as all pizza lovers know. So by controlling conditions such as the temperature and flow rate, we can manipulate the behavior of a food formulation so it can be 3D printed. Some food products that have been successfully printed due to their viscoelastic properties include dough, chocolate, mashed potato, cheese, and meat paste. 3D food printing can be used to design more visually appealing products with personalized nutrition according to a consumer's needs. For example, we know that a lot of parents struggle with encouraging their kids to eat healthy diets. To tackle this, food scientists have used 3D printing to develop food snacks based on a blend of fruit and vegetable in a shape of a cartoon character, for example, an octopus, making it more attractive and fun for the kids to eat their greens. With 3D food printing, we can control the texture of a food to make it easier to eat, which is especially important for people with chewing or swallowing difficulties. 3D printing offers the means of developing food that are designed to consist of the optimal macro and micronutrients required to match the dietary requirements of individuals, such as children, athletes, elderly, and expectant mothers. As we look to more sustainable food production, 3D food printing can help in reducing food waste, as it only prints quantities of raw materials that are required to build a structure. In my project, which is funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food, and the Marine, I'm looking at using dairy ingredients to develop 3D printed dairy snacks. We're using dairy ingredients as the proteins present in the milk provide essential properties required to build 3D objects. Milk proteins are also leading sources of high-quality protein in the human diet. Therefore, we can design snacks using dairy ingredients that have high protein content in tailored amounts for specific consumer groups. I am investigating the 3D printing parameters and the concentrations of milk proteins required to build a self-supporting structure. This dairy formulation will be used in a food-grade 3D printer that is going to be exclusively developed to print dairy snacks.
My name is Berha. I am a PhD student at Teagasc, Moore Park. By 2050, the world's population is set to reach 10 billion. To feed them, we are going to need to change how we produce our food. AI and robotics are being considered as new and sustainable techniques for food enhancement. In other words, increasing the yield or quality in production. In my PhD project, my work is focused on developing quality measurements that ensure that Irish dairy powders are consistently of a high quality. I use robots, sensors, and AI to carry out experiments and quality measurements on powders like coffee creamers and whole milk powders. For example, I programmed the robot to add a coffee creamer to coffee, similar to how the end user would do. Then the robot automatically measures the quality of the mixture using sensors and a camera. Precision measurements and AI allows us to understand what's happening in the cup so we can make changes and see how they perform. Robots can do repetitive tasks for several thousands of hours without getting bored. They also can perform particular tasks with high enough accuracy. For example, they can make the exact same cup of coffee and over again. Essentially, they are flexible machines as we can change the program to define a variety of tasks for them. There are lots of different robots being used in food plants or farms all around the world, especially for food packaging, pick-and-place applications, or even harvesting crops. Here in Teagasc, I'm working on a type of robot called a collaborative robot or a cobot. This robot is especially designed for safe interaction with humans and workers in industrial environments like dairy plants. Using a cobot, we can perform tasks that are relatively difficult and repetitive or even dangerous for humans, or tasks that require a higher level of accuracy. We use a cobot to look at the mixability of a dairy powder. With the cobot, we can examine why certain dairy powders can mix better than others. Let's take the coffee example again. Have you seen the undissolved white particles in your coffee after you add coffee creamer powder to it? As part of these experiments, researchers need to prepare the samples, for example, coffee creamers, in the same manner that the final consumer would prepare the sample. Then they can estimate the quality parameters of the final product, and if it is not suitable, then make changes to the production process. Our cobot can prepare food exactly as we do at home. How? Firstly, our cobot has 7 motors or joints in its arm, similar to a human arm, which means that it can mimic a human's movements. Secondly, our cobot can be integrated with different sensors to record and simulate what happens during the mixing process. By using a cobot, I can ensure the quality of powders by eliminating unsavory lumps in your coffee and test how new products perform against old ones by keeping the process identical every single time.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. It's great to have so many of you here with us this morning from all over the country. And I hope you're enjoying the webinar so far today. Remember, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. We'd also love you to send in photos to our email address, scienceweek@teagasc.ie, or on social media, just use hashtag #FestFarmFood or hashtag ScienceWeek. So I'd like to welcome here today some of the stars from that video. Liam Walsh is a Teagasc Walsh Scholar PhD student. Deirdre Kennedy is a technologist and manages the National Food Imaging Center at Moorpark. Ricardo Uribe Alvarez is a Teagasc Walsh Scholar PhD student. And Behrad Mozaffari is a Teagasc Walsh Scholar PhD student too. We have Muireann Egan, who'll be moderating your questions for me. But we'd love to hear from you, so do get them in. We'll try and get as many as we can. And if you are watching from a school, let us know, and we'll do a shout out for you as well. So guys, you're very welcome. Really interesting videos you all had, and quite a wide range and diversity in terms of the sort of research that you're doing. Liam, maybe we might start with you because you were the first video. That SCOBY really grossed me out, but I do like a lot of fermented food. I'm a big fan of cheese. I'm a big fan of wine, big fan of beer. Is there fermented foods that I can make at home, or is a lot of that quite commercial? Is it difficult to produce in your own kitchen?
Well, all fermented foods can be produced in your own kitchen. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing complicated ferments like, for example, tea leaves. But I know I had to give a very technical definition in that video, but if you think of fermentation, it's basically cooking with microorganisms. So I like to think of fermentation as little microbial Gordon Ramsays, with the added benefit that they've had thousands of years to perfect their recipe. So if you think about sorry, John.
Yeah, no. In terms of complicated, people that started the sourdough starters over lockdown and so on. Do you have to be a good chef? Does it take a lot of time to fiddle with it, or is it something you can just leave for a couple of days and come back to? Is that because fermented food is really a lot about time, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I was going to get back to that when I was saying that they had thousands of years to perfect a recipe. What that essentially means is you just create an environment. So, example, you give certain microorganisms just milk or sugary water, and it will consume the nutrients in those and produce a fermented product. So it is quite easy to make at home. I usually recommend using kefir, and that simply means getting microorganisms, and these are in the form of small kind of white stones that some say resemble kefir or resemble cauliflower. And you simply place those into milk and you wait 24 hours and then you get a light yogurt. So it's very easy to produce at home, 10 minutes tops to produce kefir.
Is kefir nice? I've never tasted it. People seem to be going nuts for it.
It's like a very bitter yogurt. It is quite, it takes time to adjust your palate too. But once you incorporate with that with fruit or nuts, and then it's a bit more edible and you can take it kind of 1 teaspoon at a time, and eventually you will be able to eat it en masse.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Lee. Lorraine says, hello from Barnacogue in Swinford in Mayo. And we also have lots of questions coming in. So check your Zoom and in the Q&A panel, if you want to ask your questions, you can. A big shout out to St. Anne's National School in Rathangan in Wexford. We have another question for Deirdre. Deirdre, what kind of foods can you look at in virtual reality? Is there a certain type of food that you can investigate?
Okay, so with the virtual reality, what we would need, first of all, is a 3D image stack of a food. So if we think of ourselves going for an X-ray or an MRI scan or something that builds up this 3D imaging, very, very fine, detailed 3D image set. Once we have that, we can put that into our image analysis for 3D and then into our virtual reality for 4D. So any food, I suppose, that we can obtain this 3D image set for, so something that can go under, maybe a CT scanner or something like that. So we have, some self-supporting structure. The more self-supporting the structure, the better. But then sometimes we have done absolutely tiny structures, such as individual powder particles and stuff like that, with Nano Ct scanners and stuff. So, we'd hope that eventually we'd be able to look at most foods with this technology.
A Nano Ct scanner. What on earth is that?
So again, when we're talking about microscopy, we talk about resolution. So the ability to resolve, individual particles, individual, materials. So with the Nano Ct scanner, we're basically looking at a CT scanner that can resolve down to the nanometer level, which is what we required to look at something like our powder particles. So a powder particle might be, a couple of microns in width or depth. But we want to see the individual particles within that. So we need it to resolve at the nanometer level just to see maybe the individual proteins and the fat droplets and stuff like that. So obviously the more powerful the microscope, often the biggest microscopes give us the tiniest, details. So it really depends on the application.
And could you, for example, do a CT scan of a microorganism like yeast?
Yeah, I would think, again, it would probably be at the same kind of level. You'd probably want to be using one of these high-powered, maybe Nano Ct scanners. I mean, yeasts are often bigger than bacteria and stuff, so you probably would have a good chance of getting a good 3D structure of that. You'd probably be pushing it a little bit, that the smaller the particle, the harder it's going to be, So, I think it's probably something that's always work in progress. The microscopes are getting more and more high power. They're resolving at the tiniest levels more and more. So, again, I wouldn't doubt that there's somebody working on it somewhere.
Ricardo, we have a question for you. Can you eat the 3D foods? Can you eat the 3D food?
Yes, but we have to be careful. For eating 3D food, we need a printer that is made of food-grade materials. So in that case, we can have healthy and safe food for you.
When we use a 3D printer, we're obviously applying layer and layer of these food particles, right? What is the benefit of doing that, apart from making funny shapes? Can we add texture? Can we alter the experience of food greatly, do you think?
Of course. We can formulate foods to print and have a similar flavor to some of the original foods that we have, but also we can modify the texture. For example, if we use a carrot mash as a 3D printed material, we can have a carrot snack that tastes like a carrot, but has a different texture, much more softer, that will be easier for you to eat it.
Very good. Do you envisage us being able to 3D print burgers, for example, exactly the way we want, or is meat, because of its nature, a little bit trickier?
It's a difficult process, but it's been already investigated, and there are successful already experiments going on with flavors that really look, that taste really look like the original.
Very good. Liam, I have a question for you. Can you have too many Actimel yogurts?
You can certainly overdo it when consuming fermented foods. Yes, you certainly can. So, for example, often fermented dairy products like Actimel that have a large amount of lactic acid and other acids, and that can have some negative effects on your tooth enamel. So what we usually recommend in Teagasc is to usually consume it maybe once or twice a day between meals or with meals.
Very good. Behrad, we have a question about coding, what sort of coding you use, and also what the difference is between a cobot and a robot, because I don't know that.
Sure. First of all, the code is related to the robot itself. It has a graphical user interface. So in that video, I am using that type of code, which is relatively easy to use to program the robot. And it is the programming. It is called the programming, actually. But in more advanced applications, we can use different languages like C++, Python, and then make some communication between them. But in that video, yes, I was using the graphical user interface of the robot itself. And the difference between a cobot and a robot, cobots or collaborative robots themselves are actually a subcategory of robots. We have a large variety of robots, for example, medical robots, industrial robots, humanoid robots, companion robots, etc. And cobots are built in such a way to interact with people safely and work alongside workers in industrial environments.
Yeah, you don't want your robot to be swinging a knife around
Exactly.
in the lab. Liam, you also use coding. Can you tell us a little bit about your language? I have a feeling there's a lot of people watching this who are thinking, should I be studying a particular language, or is this an important thing if I want to work in your area? What sort of coding do you use?
Well, for interpreting DNA technology data sets, which have a large amount of nucleotides, we'll use commands on a Linux platform. So this will allow us to identify what microorganisms are present in a sample, let's say,
Right,
as well as what they're doing and how they're interacting with other members in that ecosystem. In terms of looking at the data, how we visualize the data, we use RStudio or R and Python. They're two coding languages. If you were beginning learning coding, I'd really recommend using Python, because it kind of teaches you all the basics, and then you can branch out from that and become confident in other coding areas. But yeah, a lot of data visualization as well as statistics is done in R.
We noticed over lockdown, everybody was doing sourdough bread, Liam. I'm wondering, because it's fermented, is it any better than any other type of bread?
Oh, absolutely. So if you think, let's say, gluten content, for example, sourdough bread is recorded to have a lot less gluten in it compared to normal bread.
Oh.
That's one particular example. It's also enriched in vitamins, minerals, and some polyphenols as well, due to the actions of microorganisms. So certainly it is more healthy than non-fermented counterparts.
Okay, good to know. Deirdre, can you tell us what these bacteria look like under the microscope, and whether or not, looking at the bacteria, you can actually tell which one is which, or do they all look like a big squiggly nest to you?
Yeah, so again, I suppose it would depend on what microscope you're using. You'd have different microscopes for different applications. I would say most microscopes, we can pick out bacteria, and certainly the fermentation bacteria. We wouldn't be able to identify them to the level like that Liam is talking about when he's using the DNA sequencing and the PCR and those kind of things. What you'll have is the different microorganisms will have different morphology. They'll have, they might be able to identify them based on maybe their outer coat, their shape, their size. I think in the video there we saw there was a close-up of actually an electron micrograph image of lactobacillus and lactococcus actually live inside a yogurt. So that's something an image that we took with our cryo scanning electron microscope. So we can actually see the lactobacillus, which are these long kind of oblong rods, and then you can actually see the lactococcus, which are these small kind of spheres. So again, we could kind of have a good idea of what we're looking at, but to really, really identify them down to a species level, you're talking back to the kind of stuff Liam was talking about, the DNA sequencing and the PCR and that kind of a thing.
I have a tricky one for you now, Deirdre. The microorganisms that produce this fermentation process, is there anything different about them than other microorganisms that don't ferment food?
Are you talking about to see under the microscope, or
yeah, well, either to see, or do they have a different set of DNA, or do they have a different shape? What is it that makes an organism ferment food and eat food and provide that fermentation?
Well, I suppose from our point of view as dairy scientists, for us, it's what their substrates, what they like. So they like the lactose that's there in the dairy product. So their ability to convert this to lactic acid is what we exploit. So that's what they're quite specific for. So they're called lactic acid bacteria for a reason, and they're the ones that are traditionally used because they like this lactose and they do these tests. The actual specifics, I might refer you back to Liam for those as the expert microbiologist here. But again, they are the ones that we study as dairy scientists. Absolutely, yeah.
Very good. Keep your questions coming in the Q&A section of Zoom. We're getting as many as we can. For Ricardo, we have a question from Megan. Can you break down the lactose in dairy so 3D products would be suitable for lactose intolerant people? So would you be able to print lactose-free 3D printed milk, for example?
Yes, we can make this type of products. However, it's not going to be during the 3D printing process. We have to prepare the foods with suitable nutriments before, and then we already have, or let's call it 3D dairy ink free of lactose. We can start printing some food snacks.
Is it possible with a 3D printer to create flavors or experiences with food that don't exist yet? Is it possible to do that?
Absolutely. Like, we are open to a new world of possibilities of combining different flavors, different materials that will make the texture softer or harder, however you want it. So it's a new way of producing food snacks that will also bring the possibility to make it personalized according to your nutrition needs.
And Megan has another question for you, Ricardo. She says, is dairy the best base for 3D printing, or can you use any food?
Several types of food can be used. Mostly those that have a paste or gel consistency are the best for 3D printing nowadays. You might think that this limits the possibilities of having 3D printed food, but if you consider all the combinations of doughs, cheeses, types of minced meat you can have, we have plenty good amount of meals that can be 3D printed. And just to mention some examples, here's like the 3D printed pizzas, pancakes, chocolate desserts, jellies, burgers, and many more.
Behrad, how much is robotics key to food processing at the moment? Are there robots everywhere, or is this a fairly new technology that is growing?
In the food industry, it is relatively new, but we can see robotics in different industries, like automotive industry, which began first. But yes, in food industry, it is relatively new, and this is why I am here in Teagasc, because I found it interesting, and I have a keen interest in application of robots in food. So yes, this is relatively new and novel and challenging as well.
Yeah, I bet it is. In terms of robots, the benefits over humans, obviously, you said one of the things is that they can perform repetitive tasks over and over again. How important is precision when it comes to food and food testing? Because that's obviously one of the real benefits of a robot, the precision of the action and the amounts it's using.
Yes, for example, in that movie you saw the camera, and we can stay on standards, and because the robots can do the same task without getting bored or without making mistake, so we can follow the standards with the robots. And yes, this is why we are inspecting the quality of powder using robots.
Yeah, and so that sort of consistency is key for powders like infant formula, right?
Exactly. It's a bit difficult to measure the quality of powder, dairy powder, and because several parameters, it is related to, we have to measure several parameters at the same time. And yes, we are using robots to make structures for the measurements and to follow the standards.
Liam, I wanted to ask whether or not all fermented food was good for you. Are there particular fermented foods that actually are harmful?
Yeah, there is with some fermented fishes or some fermented vegetables, there is a high salt content as well as some biogenic amines in, let's say, fermented fish. And if those are consumed above the recommended daily limit, you can have some adverse health effects. So again, it comes.
What do you mean by adverse health effects, Liam?
It's linked to, let's say, I don't want to scare people, but it's linked to, let's say, a cardiovascular health, negative effects on cardiovascular health, promoting in some cases cancer. Now, they're only links, but there is that evidence there. So it does come back to everything in moderation. So there was an interesting, they reported in some communities that consume excess amounts of fermented fish and fermented vegetables, and they had some adverse health effects in terms of cancer. Well, when they delved further into the data, they identified that these individuals who had this had these cancerous phenotypes of this cancer, basically they were consuming just the fermented vegetables, and they were having a high salt concentration as well. So they were basically exceeding their daily recommended limit over a period of time, and that's why they had adverse health effects. But again, if you have fermented foods in moderation, perfectly healthy, and they will contribute to health.
Yeah, I don't think we eat a lot of fermented fish here, but I know it can be quite popular in Scandinavia.
Yeah, there's surströmming, I think it is. It's a light fermented herring that's very popular there. So it's associated with, it's supposed to be really, really stinky, really pungent. So I don't think I'll be trying it anytime soon.
I have both tried it and smelt it, and it smells like a sewer. I don't understand how people can eat that food, surströmming. Question for Liam from Joan. Best foods to ferment aside from dairy. Shop bought sourdough is pasteurized. Is it any good?
It is pasteurized, absolutely. But see, when you are using, when you're baking, so those microorganisms are killed when you're baking them anyway. But usually I would avoid store-bought foods because they are usually pasteurized. In terms of any fermented foods that I usually recommend, a lot, if you ferment your own sauerkraut. So we have done some studies looking at the microorganisms in sauerkraut, and they are a considerable good source of live microorganisms. So what I would always recommend is fermented vegetables, but again, don't consume them in excess.
Deirdre, when you understand the structure of an organism or a type of food, is it possible then to perhaps change it, to change the experience of the food? If you're looking at food particles and the shape of them, is it possible to use that knowledge to change how they taste or look?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's exactly what we do, or what we try to do. So we would have a lot of researchers working on different types of foods. We would have a lot of PhD students, and a lot of what we do is helping clients in the food industry actually achieve this. So if we can have these fancy microscopes that they don't have on their premises, they might formulate a food, then there could be a problem with it. There could be, maybe an adverse taste, adverse texture, something different maybe from the last time they made a batch or something like this. So we can take a look at the overall structure of a food and try and deduce from that what's actually happening entirely throughout the entire food. So, with a range of techniques, again, it would be specific, there'd be some different applications for different types of foods and different types of ingredients. But we would something as simple as changing, you know, you might have the same protein content, but you might change your protein source. So if you're going from a dairy protein to, you know, a vegetable protein like soy or something like that, absolutely the taste is going to be changed. The structure is going to be completely different. It's going to react differently to your pasteurization process. It's going to interact differently to things like starches, to things like bacteria. So it's really, really, you know, easy to say I have two foods with the same final composition, but actually they're completely different when you look at the structure. So therefore they're going to act differently, they're going to taste differently, they're going to have different functionalities. So we try to do that. We try to help people out to understand this, you know, especially from the formulation point of view, and, you know, see what the final structure is, and can changing something like one of the ingredients result in a completely final different structure, different texture, different taste. So yeah, that's exactly what we kind of aim to do.
I'm going to ask you another tricky question. Sorry, Deirdre, you're getting them all. But if we imagine into the future, would we possibly be able to theoretically synthesize food? So make synthetic versions of food by understanding how these molecules and these microorganisms that you're looking at, how they interact with our taste buds and the cells that taste, our gustatory cells.
Yeah, well, I think that seems to be kind of the way things are going. You know, I think like for the likes of 3D printing and, you know, people coming up with these formulations that, you know, based on, you know, I suppose synthetic meats and synthetic, you know, different types of foods. I think that's probably, the knowledge isn't just from, obviously from something like the microscope. You get it from the people who study the texture, the people who study the sensory, the people who study the formulating, the people who are processing and so on. So I think, you know, there's so much research going on at the minute, and that's exactly, you know, what we're doing, trying to building up these pictures of these ideal foods, and, you know, getting down to the real scientific level of what's happening. Are they good for you? Are they good for your gut? Are they good? And then, you know, you often see, oh, there's a big, you know, there's a big love for something for 10 years, and then all of a sudden, you know, 10 years later, it's bad for you and so on. So
yeah.
So I think we'll probably never get to this ideal, you know, we want to make this food and only eat this forever. But you can probably, from a wealth of knowledge, you know, think what you want to, you know, have as complete foods and what way, you know, you'd like to consume them and all that. But probably a long way off. But I think it's definitely the way things are heading.
When I was younger, I watched a TV program called The Jetsons, and in The Jetsons, it was set in the future. And they had a machine where you just pressed a button and it just synthesized the food that they wanted. Now, that seems very much sci-fi, but I suppose theoretically, if you have those building blocks of molecules or amino acids available, theoretically, something like that in the distant future might be possible. Ricardo, a question for you. Are there any 3D printed foods on the market?
There are a few examples. Let's remember it's an early stage 3D food printing. For example, there's a EU program in Germany that they're creating meals for seniors that have problem with chewing. So as I told you before, we can manipulate the texture so they make meals that are soft for them and easy to swallow. Also, there are some selected restaurants that are using already 3D printed to create like these designs for desserts, very complex, that it will be very difficult to do it by hands. And another example is 3D printers that are already being used, sold to persons to have it at their homes, so they can create their own formulations of vegetables and things like that, and they can create a figure that will be interesting for the kids to have it. Let's say broccoli, kids will not like it just in the raw way, but if you create a broccoli paste in shape of a dinosaur, it's very attractive for them.
Suckers. The 3D printing thing is an interesting one to me because, you know, there's all this talk about organic food, and I know Teagasc does a lot of research in getting the best yield from, you know, making sure that we have sustainable and organic food or farming that's really clean and good for the environment and good for animals. When we think about 3D printing, it's the most processed approach to food that I could possibly think of. Is there a demand for 3D printed food, do you think?
At the moment, like I told you, it's in the early stage, so not a lot of people know this technology being used still in the food industry. Even the big food companies are starting to develop because they see a great potential because you can manipulate the nutrition of the food products. As we see, there's a lot of health diseases nowadays, and with this type of food, you can target better nutritional profile for specific consumers that have these diseases.
Okay, yeah. So there's obviously quite specialist food needs, almost a crossover to the medical world. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but we can also make foods with special nutrients for athletes,
Yeah.
or expectant mothers. Like we have a big door of options in this technology.
So really personalized food, sort of tinkered to the exact requirements of that person at that time. Liam, Nancy asks, fermented foods have high histamine. Can they be consumed by people with histamine sensitivity? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. And that actually caught me for a second and I had to think about it. I wouldn't recommend if you have histamine sensitivity eating fermented foods. There is studies out there that show that certain fermented foods like kimchi can have some antihistamine effects, but those need to be validated first. So the best thing to say to you is the results aren't there at the moment to confirm any antihistamine activity. So I would stay away from fermented foods if you do.
Another one for you from Micrea saying, why is apple cider vinegar recommended as a health food?
Well, it comes back to what I was saying in the previous question. So there has been studies that reported that apple cider vinegar has antimicrobial and antioxidant effects. And there's evidence to suggest it does offer health benefits such as aiding weight loss and reducing cholesterol. Now, those haven't been verified. So we can't verify any health benefits about fermented foods unless they're backed by vigorous scientific testing in the form of large-scale human-specific clinical trials. That isn't available at the moment. And the only EU-approved health claim concerns live yogurt cultures improving lactose digestion. So while there is good evidence there, it hasn't been backed at the moment. So it's probably due to the fact that there has been some studies that have reported findings about apple cider vinegar having health benefits, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Absolutely. Thanks, Liam. Question and answer tool on Zoom is how you can get your questions to us. Shout out to Monkstown, St. Oliver Plunkett's National School, Room 5. Hello. Thanks for joining us. Behrad, there's a lot of talk at the moment about robots taking over the jobs of humans. And I'm wondering if you had thoughts on that. If we replace the humans involved in food making with robots, is there a worry there for people who have that as their livelihood?
That's a good question, and but the answer is controversial. But there are lots of talks about the answer. Some people say they are going to create more jobs as they did before. For example, in current industries, you can see people are being engaged in more valuable tasks. For example, tasks that require thinking, require planning. So they say robots are going to create new jobs and more valuable jobs for them. And I think so. I am in support of this thinking, but some people are worried about stealing jobs from people. Yes, this is the answer, but as I said, there are lots of talks about it.
It's not a question you're going to answer in a 5-minute Zoom conversation.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
For sure.
But if you look at the past, you can realize that robots are going to create new jobs. For example, like what cell phones did in our society, like the robots are doing in the current industry. For example, mass production of automobiles or mass production of food. Yes, I think this is the answer.
Very good. I used to work in a packing factory in Sydney in Australia, and it was my job to open up the doors of a truck and take out rows and rows and rows of ladies' clothes put stickers on them, and then pack them into boxes. And it was the most boring task ever. And if a robot were to take over that job, I would have actually paid the robot my salary to do it. So there are definitely jobs, I think, that robots could help us with. Keep your comments coming into us. I hope you're enjoying your Science Week, folks. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email scienceweek@teagasc.ie, send us some photographs of what you're up to, or you can use the hashtag FarmFestFood, FestFarmFood on Twitter or Science Week as well. Question for Ricardo: can 3D printing mimic endangered or overeaten foods like oceanic animals? So that's an interesting question. Things that we really enjoy to eat that maybe we shouldn't. Maybe foie gras, for example, is one of those taboo foods. Could 3D printing provide an alternative to these sort of foods that we shouldn't probably be eating?
Absolutely. 3D printing brings this potential benefit to change our consuming behavior to a more sustainable, meanwhile still keeping those tastes that we like. And I have an example. There's a Danish startup that they're now developing a vegan salmon. So salmon nowadays it's been like the production capture of salmon, it's in danger. It's an endangered species, and somehow they are now using 3D printing to recreate the flavor, the texture of salmon, and have it in your table.
Wow, that would be great, wouldn't it? Because to be able to eat the food that tastes really good without worrying about it. Could you 3D print chocolate that tastes really good but doesn't have lots of fat, or are we pushing it? You seem to think that every question I've asked you, Ricardo, I've said, can 3D printing do this? And you're like, yes, absolutely. So how about that one? Can it print chocolate that's not fatty but tastes just as good?
Yeah, you want to put me now in the spot, yeah. Yeah, so let's see the 3D printing machine, let's see it as a chef at your home. Like you are providing the material, and 3D printing is just creating the shape as you want. So before that, you have to formulate the food. And the food formulation, we can manipulate. Food scientists already know the basis of flavors, of the nutrients, everything. So all the food science, it's being put in developing the food material for 3D printing. And we might not be still on that point that we can create everything with 3D printing, but food science, as it keeps researching these topics, we're finding ways of at least producing products similar to what you mentioned.
Okay, very good. Question for you, Liam. People are used to the idea of bacteria being harmful. You know, all the products in the home cleaning shelf say kills 99% of bacteria, like that's a good thing. When we're fermenting at home, is there a risk of introducing harmful bacteria in the process if we don't have everything clean? Could we possibly be culturing and growing something that's very dangerous to us, like salmonella?
Well, with any food, there is a risk of, obviously, there is a risk of introducing some harmful pathogens if you don't maintain good cleaning practices. But I always, when I'm asked this question a lot, and I always think of sauerkraut, for example. So in sauerkraut, you're literally submerging cabbage in a salt solution. And what you'll sometimes see is at the surface of that, where it's exposed to air, you'll actually see yeast growing. And they'll tend to grow, and you can just scoop them away, but you'll never see the yeast growing just underneath the water. Now, these things grow like wildfire. You've seen them in the fridge. They grow like crazy. But for some reason, fermentation ensures that that fungus doesn't go into your liquid. So that's an example of just how safe fermentation is, if you want a visual example of that. So in general, fermentation is regarded as safe. The actions of the microorganisms, the actions of the microorganisms directly affect the biological activity of bad bacteria. And they also create an environment, typically by acidifying the environment, reducing the pH, and again creating an environment that bad bacteria cannot survive in. So generally they are safe. The microorganisms are directly competing against bad bacteria. And if you think about it, it is a preservation technique that's been practiced for thousands of years, with records dating back as far as 7,000 BC. So I'm pretty sure it's safe.
Yeah, we were doing a show on Tuesday and we were eating century eggs, which are a type of fermented egg where it's preserved using lye, and it goes very jelly-like and solid in the middle. And when you take a bite out of it, it tastes like sulfur. It's not a particularly pleasant taste, but they're called century eggs for a reason. The idea is that they would be preserved for quite some time. Wrong 6, Skull and Chartaleok say, are 3D printed foods stored in the fridge, Ricardo? Do you have to store 3D printed foods in the fridge?
So it will depend on the type of meal that is 3D printed. Like ones like snacks, yeah, you will prefer to print it and then you can store it in the fridge. But there are other meals that will have to be eaten on the moment because it's ideally prepared on a time that it has to be consumed.
Okay, and we're quite close to time, so maybe just for the audience at home, we might quickly go through each of you with a short answer, if you can, just telling us a little bit about how you ended up doing the research that you're doing. Really interesting stuff, but how did you find yourself there? We'll start with you, Deirdre. How did you get there?
Yeah, I suppose I always liked science in school and the kind of the biology and the chemistry and that kind of side of things. So I did food science and technology in Limerick, University of Limerick, and I did my PhD there as well. So straight after that, I came to the food chemistry department in Teagasc here. And I worked in a number of different roles actually before I found my kind of final calling. So, the more you try with science, there's always something, to learn. There's always different projects. There's always different roles. So, so that's how I ended up where I am now.
The great thing about Teagasc is as we said, just today and tomorrow alone, let alone all of the events this week, such a wide variety of things you can get involved in.
No 2 days are the same, I would say, in the kind of jobs that we do, which is what I think if you have that kind of personality, that's what you're after. Research is definitely, something to consider.
Berhad, how did you get into it?
I have obtained a master's degree in mechatronics, which is a combination of mechanical engineering and electronic engineering. And there I was building robots and working with robots in my master's degree. Then I started to study my PhD in electronic engineering, dairy science and technology, because as I said, I was interested in application of robots in food. And then I started my work in Teagasc, and I'm doing my project, and it is really enjoyable for me, the environment and my project. And yes.
Right. Ricardo?
I was very interested in chemistry when I was in high school. And I thought, like, if I like this, what I can apply to. And then I said, like, okay, food, because food might change through time, but people will always have to eat something. So it's how I started. I did my bachelor in food engineering, then master's in food technology, and then here I have all the knowledge to start doing the 3D printing research.
Very good. And finally, Liam.
Yeah, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in sixth year. And I remember going through my CAO choices with my teacher. He just casually asked around the class and he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him my choices, and he gave out to me heavy criticism. Do something in science. So I put down something in science. I did genetics in UCC. I kind of became fascinated by microorganisms.
Yeah.
So many, you really have endless opportunities with microorganisms. They're kind of like miniature factories. It can be used in biofuel production, for example, and it can be used in a food setting. So I decided to do a PhD in microbiology then in Teagasc.
Liam, thanks very much. And thanks indeed to all my panelists today, those who featured in the video and everyone behind the scenes at Teagasc. And finally, tomorrow for our grand finale, I'll be presenting A Taste of the Future with scientists from Teagasc Ashtown Food Research Centre. And we can promise you a bit of entertainment as well as lots of great science. But that's not all. We have lots of other initiatives going on this week. To find out more about these and the rest of our events, go to teagasc.ie, where you'll find a link to all of our Science Week events on the main page. They'll be on all at the same time, 11 a.m. So we'll see you tomorrow. We'll also be featuring all of our videos from the week on our live Zoom recordings on the Teagasc YouTube page. But for now, thanks very much. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Have a great Science Week.